Hello, everyone. Today, I want you to close your eyes for a moment, just long enough to picture the pyramids of Egypt not as they are today, but as they might have shimmered in the heat of the ancient sun. Gleaming white limestone reaching defiantly into a cloudless sky, a sight meant to impress the gods and intimidate the living. But behind this dazzling vision was something else entirely. You've probably seen them in travel brochures, documentaries, maybe even textbooks. Symbols of mystery, engineering, and ancient brilliance. Yet those iconic stones, each weighing more than a small car, didn't levitate into place by magic or genius alone. They were pulled, hauled, lifted, and stacked by hands. Thousands and thousands of hands. Many of them broken, bleeding, and trembling from hunger. Tonight, we're stepping behind the illusion, behind the image polished by centuries of admiration. This isn't the story of pharaohs or even architects. It's the story of backs bent under stone, of dust that never left the lungs, of lives used up, quietly, invisibly, for the sake of eternal monuments. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And now, dim the lights, slow your breath, and come with me to where the sand still remembers. You were born far from the palace walls, your skin already kissed by the desert sun, your feet used to walking without sandals, your name, like your mother's and father's, not meant to be written on any stone. But the state knew you, knew your body could be useful. They came in the planning season, or sometimes right after. Officials dressed in linen, holding lists and promises. Maybe they said it was your turn, or that it was an honor. Maybe they didn't bother explaining. Either way, you found yourself walking towards something you'd only heard rumors of, a mountain being built by men. And so, the illusion begins. For even as your village faded behind you, you believed, for a moment, that this might be better than starving, that a job near the pharaoh's tomb might mean something safer than war, or kinder than tax. But as the sun rose higher, and your group marched in silence, the shimmer in the distance turned out to be no oasis. Just dust, wind, and the shadow of something impossible. The pyramid wasn't finished, of course. It would take decades, whole generations. But the work never stopped. And when you arrived, your body still unmarked by the tools of labor, you realized it was the pyramid that owned time now. Not the sun, not the king, not even the gods. Just the pyramid. There was no grand entrance, no ceremony. Just shouted orders, piles of ropes, stones the size of livestock, and a sound. The sound of thousands of men breathing, coughing, dragging. And here is the great paradox. From a distance, it looked eternal. Up close, it looked like chaos. Dust in every eye. Blood on every rope. Heat that clung to your skin like regret. And the noise, not of worship, not of chanting, but of muscle and bone straining against a task no one could finish alone. They say the pyramids were built by skilled laborers, not slaves. That maybe you were a conscripted peasant or a seasonal worker paid in bread and beer. But you knew what the history books do not. When you can't leave, when your body's not yours, when the only pay is survival, does the title even matter? You weren't chained, but you were trapped. Each day began in darkness. You'd wake to the clatter of others rising, the stink of cramped sleeping quarters, the cold silence before the first order was yelled. The pyramid loomed even in dreams. It was never still, not in your mind. Some men hoped to be stone cutters, better tools, maybe some shade. But you were put on a transport crew. Trenches dug through sand, sledges groaning under stone. Your hands blistered by noon, your breath shallow by afternoon. And still the overseers shouted, as if noise could force the earth to yield faster. Lunch was a crust, maybe a cup of beer if the day had gone well. You didn't taste it. You just counted how many bites until it was gone. Somewhere along the ramp, a man would fall. You wouldn't turn your head. You couldn't. Not because you were cold, but because stopping meant punishment, or replacement, or both. The pyramid grew, slowly, stone by stone. And yet, somehow, your life shrank. Your name stopped mattering. You were you there, or pull harder, or silence. You used to dream of other things. Planting season, songs your mother used to hum, the smell of warm lentils. But those dreams were distant now. Sand had filled in their edges. The pyramid had taken them too. And at night, lying on straw, your body aching in ways you couldn't name, you wondered, how could something so big feel so empty? But still, you woke the next day, and the next. Not because of duty, not for the pharaoh, but because your body moved even when your spirit paused. The illusion was not just the pyramid's perfection. It was the idea that its builders were proud. Pride is hard to feel when your mouth tastes like sand, and your bones whisper stories of collapse. Yet the illusion remains. Tourists marvel. Scholars debate. Guides speak of wonder. And you disappeared into the stone. Not buried beneath it. Worse, forgotten within it. But tonight, we remember. O nascimento da pedra, onde começa o sofrimento. You weren't born under the pyramid's shadow, but the stone was. Long before it reached your hands, or the hands of any man, it slept deep in the belly of the earth. Before the chants, before the construction, before the king even dreamed of eternal monuments, there was a mountain, quiet, still and stubborn. And that's where you began. Not as a builder, not even as a carrier, but as a fragment of someone else's ambition. Pulled from sleep like the stone itself. The quarries were far from the river, far from shade, far from mercy. Out there, even the silence hurt. It hummed in the heat, pressed against your ears like the weight of the air had thickened. You wake before the sky turns blue. The stars are still above you, disinterested in what's to come. You eat something. Stale bread, mostly. Just enough to remind your stomach that it must wait. And then, the cutting begins. There's no magic in how stone is removed. Just copper tools dulled by repetition. Wedges of wood soaked in water to split cracks wider. Hammers that vibrate through your spine. It's slow. It's unforgiving. It's loud in a way that the ears never get used to. Not because of the sharpness, but because of the rhythm. That relentless, dead rhythm of break, strike, drag. You don't carve art. You carve volume. Every piece cut to fit a dream not yours. Every edge smoothed for a god who will never touch it. The quarry is alive, but only in its demands. The overseers walk with sticks, not just to beat, but to point. They don't need to yell. Their presence is enough. You know what happens if you slow down. You've seen it. A man whose hands gave up. A boy who misjudged the weight. A shoulder pulled out of place. a leg broken by a slip. And no, there's no shrine for him, no song, only fewer rations for the day. The dust settles into your eyes, your throat, your thoughts. You taste stone now, always. It coats your teeth, it scratches your dreams, your hair is stiff with it. Your sweat turns to mud on your skin. There's no washing it off. You're part of the quarry now, and it is part of you. At midday, the light is so strong it erases shapes. Shadows vanish. And without them, the world feels flat, like a punishment. There's no place to hide, not even in your own body. You glance at others. Some are older than you, bones sharp under skin. Some are young, too young. They shouldn't be here, but no one says anything anymore. And then the moving begins. The blocks, massive and stubborn, must be shifted, rolled, dragged, encouraged like beasts that do not breathe. Dozens of hands, ropes made from palm fiber, groans that rise together. It's not coordination, it's survival. The sledges creak. The earth groans beneath them. You pull with everything, your feet slipping in the dust. Your shoulders scream, but you don't stop. Stopping is not an option. Sometimes the stone breaks in the wrong place, a crack too deep, a wedge misplaced. Hours, days wasted. And then comes the shouting, the punishment. The silence afterward is worse than the noise. The stone has no sympathy, no understanding. And yet, it becomes your God. You listen to it more than to your own thoughts. By evening, your body doesn't belong to you. It's a thing that once knew comfort, now a tool. Your hands can't close fully. Your back twitches when you lie down. You dream of slipping into the rock, of becoming still finally. But morning comes again. Some say the stone is eternal, that what you cut will outlive dynasties, that your effort is carved into history. But it doesn't feel like legacy. It feels like loss, like something taken from you before you had a chance to offer it freely. You once asked, quietly, who decides where the stone goes? Someone laughed. The ones who never touch it. That's the truth, isn't it? The vision is theirs. The labor is yours. And between the two, the silence grows. Still, you keep cutting, keep dragging, keep moving, because the stone does not wait. And neither does the overseer. And when night falls and the stars return, you lie beneath them not as a man, but as a shadow of one. You wonder if they see you from the palace, if anyone thinks about where the pyramid begins, because it doesn't begin in glory. It begins here, with the broken mountain and the breaking of men. Carregar, oh, impossible. O corpo como machina, you've cut the stone. Now you must move it. It begins before the sun, always before the sun, because by the time the heat awakens fully, the work must already be half done, or else it won't be done at all. You don't remember when it stopped being shocking. The size of the blocks, the sheer impossibility of what you're told to do with them. At first, you gawked, tried to calculate how many men it would take, wondered what sort of magic tethered these monsters to the desert floor. But now, you just tie the rope. Your hands are part of a system now. Like ants on a grain of rice, you and dozens of others surround a single block of limestone. Sometimes it's basalt, darker and heavier, used for internal chambers. Sometimes granite so dense it mocks your efforts. But the instructions never change. Pull. You're given water, bread, sometimes dates. But it's not nourishment, it's fuel, like oil for a fire. just enough to keep the flame from flickering out. The sledges groan, their wooden runners greased with mud or animal fat. Sometimes water is poured on the sand to reduce friction. A trick someone figured out long ago. A kindness, perhaps. But the sand fights back anyway. You press your shoulder into the rope. You lean your whole weight into it. You grit your teeth and pretend your body is not screaming. The man next to you is limping. The one ahead of you is coughing, deep, ragged, as if each breath scrapes his lungs. Still, the block moves, inch by inch, a beast tamed by nothing but pain. It doesn't feel like progress. It feels like penance, like you're dragging not stone, but time itself. And it's not just forward. The ramps angle upward, long spirals of packed earth that wind around the growing structure. You never see the top. It's too far. Always too far. Each incline is a betrayal. You think you're near the edge, then the sand shifts, and you realize the slope continues. Your calves burn. Your back tightens. You wonder if it would be easier to fall. Just fall and let the dust cover you. But someone is watching. Always. With a stick or a glare, or silence sharpened into expectation. The hardest part isn't the weight. It's the repetition. Stone after stone. Day after day. Each one identical. Each one demanding. You forget where you are. You forget how many days it's been. The sun mocks you with its regularity. The wind is no relief. It only throws sand into your eyes, your mouth, the open cracks in your skin. And yet, something keeps you upright. Not hope, that's too soft. Not loyalty, that's long gone. Maybe it's rhythm, like a song you can't stop humming. The movement becomes everything. You start to measure time not in hours, but in blocks. How many today? How far did we go? Your body adapts. It hardens. Not just the muscles, but the nerves, the patience, the pain tolerance. You learn to ignore the blisters, to breathe through the ache, to accept the days when your vision blurs from exhaustion. The pyramid rises. You rise with it, slowly, painfully. And when a stone reaches its place and settles with a final thud, there's no applause, no gratitude. Just another rope, another block, another order. Sometimes you hear a name shouted. Someone fell. Someone crushed. Sometimes the body's pulled aside before you even reach the spot. The work doesn't stop. Ever. You think of your own name. How long before they forget it too? Yet, sometimes when the sun sets just right, and the ramp glows orange, and the stone seems to breathe with the heat it absorbed all day, you feel it. Not pride, not satisfaction. Something smaller. A flicker. Like the whisper of wind inside a cracked wall. You moved that. You, with your bruised hands and trembling legs. You shifted what should be unmovable. It won't be remembered. But it happened. And that's something. Even if your body becomes just another tool. Worn, discarded, replaced. You were here. You pulled the impossible. O chicote e o calendario solar. There's a rhythm to suffering. And in Egypt, that rhythm was solar. The sun didn't just light your days. It ruled them, measured them, punished them. Time wasn't your own, not even close. You didn't count it with joy, but with dread. And the overseers, they carried no clocks. They watched shadows, listened to bells, studied the sky like priests, and interpreted it like tyrants. You rose with the first glow on the horizon, not because you wanted to, but because that was the rule. And rules were not written in ink. They were burned into your back, etched into the behavior of those who fell out of step. The work started in silence. Always. There were no greetings, no chatter. Just the shuffle of feet, the creak of ropes, the first commands of the day. Short, sharp, and cold. And then came the expectations. Each crew had a quota, a number of stones, a distance to cover, a length to dig. It didn't matter if someone was sick. It didn't matter if the wind was cruel that day, or if a tool broke, or if your fingers bled. The sun moved, and you had to keep pace. The overseers wore linen, light and clean. Their eyes rarely blinked. They carried staffs, not always for show. Some preferred whips. Others used silence as a blade, letting it grow thick between you until the tension snapped. Disobedience wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. A wrong look, a pause too long, a hand that shook too much. That was enough. And then you'd hear it, the whistle of the lash. Fast, efficient. One, maybe two strikes. No fanfare. Just pain, quick and deep. Enough to remind you, your body was not yours. Sometimes it was a man near you. Sometimes it was you. No one intervened. No one comforted. Everyone just kept pulling. And that was the cruelty. Not just the blow itself, but the silence around it, the normalization, the way it folded into the day, like heat or dust or thirst. The calendar was full of festivals, ceremonies, offerings to the gods. But none of them reached you. You were too far from the temples, too buried in sweat. There were moments of rest, brief, rationed, a few mouthfuls of beer, a few minutes in the shade. But even these were measured. And you began to feel like the sun itself was your enemy, watching, judging, never relenting. Noon was the worst. The shadow under your feet disappeared. You became a silhouette in blinding light. There was nowhere to hide, not even inside yourself. And yet, the quotas never changed. 1 stone today, 2 ramps cleared, a trench widened, a wall reinforced. The numbers never stopped. They replaced your thoughts. You no longer asked why. You only asked how much. And at sunset, when the work finally slowed, the pain didn't leave. It followed you to sleep, to dreams, to mornings. You started to believe time itself was a punishment, a loop designed to break men slowly. Some prayed, some went silent, some laughed at nothing. But most just endured, because to protest was to disappear, not just from the work site, from memory. The lash wasn't just leather, it was law. And the sun wasn't just fire. It was a clock, one you could never outrun. No coração do canteiro de obras by now. The pyramid isn't a myth. It isn't a distant ambition. It's a beast, one you live inside. And the canteiro de obras, the work site, is its lungs, always breathing, always heaving with movement, orders, and the scraping of stone against stone. You arrive before first light, not because you want to, but because the canteiro never sleeps. Even when your eyes close for a moment too long, it keeps pulsing. The noise hits first, not sharp, not sudden, but constant, like wind through reeds, except the reeds are men shouting, ropes creaking, tools striking, sandals dragging. It fills your ears until you forget what silence ever sounded like. Dust floats through everything. It's in the food, the sweat, the soft folds of cloth that were once white, now the color of fatigue. Your skin itches. Your mouth tastes like limestone. You cough in your sleep. There are paths worn into the ground from endless feet, Trenches, ramps, scaffolding made from palm trunks and ancient improvisations. It's not chaos, but it looks like it. Hundreds of bodies moving with separate purpose, yet bound by a single will. Build. Build. Always build. You work alongside masons who place stones with precision. Not for beauty, but because one misaligned block means disaster. You hear the overseers bark instructions. They use sticks to point. Words like level, height, drag farther. No warmth, no names. Men climb scaffolds with jars of mortar balanced on their backs. Others carry baskets of gravel. You're moving blocks again. The weight is almost comforting now. Familiar. Somewhere nearby, a man cries out. A stone slips. There's a dull, meaty sound. Then silence. You don't look. Someone else will take his place. You've learned how to move through the cantiro, like water. No sudden gestures. No eye contact with supervisors. You know where not to stand, where shadows gather and accidents happen. You've also learned to watch the sky, not for beauty, but for escape. When the sun begins to dip, your body counts the minutes. When the wind shifts, bringing cooler air, you inhale greedily, not for relief, but as a reminder that time still moves forward. Sometimes, if the overseers turn their backs, you exchange a glance with another worker. Just a glance, no words. But in that moment, you remember, you're not the only one being worn down. There's a man in your crew who hums quietly while pulling stone. No one tells him to stop. It's not a melody you recognize. It might not even be a song, but it keeps the rhythm. There's another who tells stories under his breath while smoothing mortar. You hear bits of it. Something about a river, a woman with bracelets of turquoise. Maybe it's real. Maybe it's memory turned into myth. It doesn't matter. It's noise that isn't orders. In the cantiro, the rules are invisible, but they bind tighter than ropes. You don't speak unless spoken to. You don't stop unless commanded. You don't ask why, but still you feel. You think. You remember who you were before this. And sometimes when the stone fits perfectly into place, when it lands with that satisfying thud, aligned, flush, just right, you allow yourself one moment. Not of joy, that's gone, but of clarity. You've made something hold. In a world where everything slips, night falls, slowly. The cantiro doesn't empty all at once. Some crews stay longer. Some tasks spill past dark. Torches flicker. The dust settles for a few hours. You lie down in a place that still smells of work. You close your eyes, not for rest, but for escape. And even in sleep, the cantero hums, still breathing, still waiting for your hands again. Corpos que se parten en silencio. Your body was never asked for permission. It was conscripted, quietly, slowly, relentlessly, into the service of a dream not your own. And now it answers to gravity, to stone, to heat, to orders, but not to you. At first, the pain surprises you. The sudden pinch in the shoulder, the dull throb in your thighs, the way your fingers stop closing all the way. You think maybe it's just today, just this task, just this ramp. But it doesn't fade. It becomes part of you. There's no word for it in your language, perhaps. Just a sense of shrinking, a knowing that something inside you has shifted, that a small fracture has opened, and every day pours something into it. The injuries aren't spectacular. They don't make stories. They're not the kind that earn you rest, a cut from a splintered sled. a toe crushed by a rolling block, skin peeled by rope, lips cracked until they bleed, sun blisters, infection, cough that won't leave, eyes that blur at noon, knees that shake when you climb too fast. You see it in others too. A man who used to laugh now walks with a limp. A boy who never learned to tie rope correctly now carries baskets instead, his back too fragile for stone. An old worker who wraps his wrists every morning, but whose fingers barely grip a chisel anymore. They keep going, because stopping means vanishing. No one speaks of rest, not real rest. There's no infirmary, no healing ritual. Maybe herbs if someone's generous. Maybe a cloth soaked in wine. But mostly there's just grit. You begin to measure your body in failures. The arm that can no longer lift as high. The bruise that's never quite gone. The breath that takes longer to catch. Your body's not your own. It's a tool. A wheel in a machine that does not pause. And when it breaks, it's replaced. Quietly. Efficiently. You've seen it happen. A man falls, no scream. Just a thud. Maybe he slipped on a loose stone. Maybe he fainted from heat. Maybe his heart, worn too thin for too long, simply gave up. No one panics. The overseer clicks his tongue. Two others drag the body aside. Work resumes. By midday, someone new is standing in his place. No mourning, no names whispered, just sweat. Sometimes, late at night, you hear groaning. Not loud, just low and constant. A man trying not to scream as his shoulder pulses or as infection eats at a wound. No one helps. Not because they don't care, but because they can't. There are no extra hands, no spare strength. You tell yourself, I'll last longer. I'll be smarter. I'll listen to my bones. But the pyramid listens louder. And when the body gives out, when it simply refuses another step, another lift, another sunrise, there's no ceremony. Maybe a shallow grave nearby. Maybe nothing at all. Some say those buried near the site were honored, that their proximity to the pharaoh made them sacred. But you know better. They were left because it was faster. The silence is the most unbearable part. The way no one mentions the man who used to walk beside you. The way his absence becomes part of the routine, like a broken tool replaced without fuss. And you wonder, when it's your turn, will they remember your voice? Or just your pace, your hands, your spot in the line? Your body aches tonight, in places you didn't know could ache. Your fingers won't stop trembling. Your back refuses to lie flat. But still, you lie down. Still, you sleep. Because tomorrow, the stone will wait, and so must you. You've probably heard it before. They weren't slaves. They were skilled laborers, volunteers, paid in bread and beer. Maybe that's what the papyri say. Maybe that's what the tombs of overseers boast. Carvings of smiling workers, oxen grazing in the sun, harmony under the rule of a divine pharaoh. But you know better, because you're here. You know what it means to wake up without choice, to work without pause, to carry a weight that's not yours, and to feel that your exhaustion, your very breath, is someone else's property. So what were you? Not quite slave, but not free. You were born into a world where choice was illusion, where service was law, where your village owed labor in cycles, and the choice was never whether to go, but who would go this season. Sometimes your family was paid. Bread, beer, a length of cloth, but none of it made its way back to you. Sometimes you were a prisoner of war, of crime, of status. Sometimes you weren't called anything at all, just pointed at, tagged, pulled into the endless tide of labor. The myths say you were proud, that this was an honor. But pride doesn't live in hunger. Honor doesn't ease sunstroke. And stories told centuries later by men who never bled in the sand cannot explain the silence that hung over the Cantiro at dusk. You heard the whispers about compensation, rotation, workers' villages. But what good is rotation when your body doesn't recover between turns? What comfort is a hut when it's shared with 10 others and filled with coughing? You weren't shackled, but you weren't free. You could leave, in theory, but that meant punishment, replacement, shame for your family, a mark that followed you, invisible but heavy. You start to understand. Freedom isn't about chains. It's about breath, about agency, about rest that belongs to you. And that was never offered here. The lines blur between slave and servant, between worker and captive. And maybe that's what made it easier for those in power, to keep you undefined, to keep the system flexible, but your body knew the truth. It felt the same weight, the same hunger, the same fear of slipping too low to return. There were those who supervised you who weren't evil. Some offered a kind word, a better tool, a softer tone. But even they operated within the same machine. Even they bowed to quotas and the myths. Oh, the myths that you sang joyfully, that you danced after work, that you built with devotion to your king. Maybe someone did. Once. Maybe a young boy believed the pharaoh would bless him. Maybe an old man felt pride in laying the final stone. But the majority, they survived. Quietly, tirelessly, without applause. History prefers clean labels. Slaves or workers, free or forced. But you lived in the in-between, in the dust and nuance, in the aching truth that you could smile in the morning and cry by noon, that you could feel honored one day and utterly disposable the next. You carry this contradiction like you carry the stone, because you must. And when you lie in the dark, you wonder, centuries from now, what will they say you were? And will they believe it mattered? The sun has dipped behind the horizon finally. And with it, the last shouts of the overseers fade into the dry evening air. You feel it, not rest, not relief exactly, but the absence of urgency, like a door half closed on exhaustion. You walk slowly, careful not to twist your ankle in the grooves etched by 1,000 feet before yours. The dust still clings to you, mixed with sweat, blood, maybe something like pride, though it's hard to tell anymore. The village where you sleep isn't really a village. It's a scatter of mud brick huts, sheds, and shared spaces. If you're lucky, you have a mat to lie on. If you're luckier still, you have a wall to lean against. But tonight, like most nights, your only certainty is the ache in your legs. There's food. Sometimes. A stew of lentils, onions, if supplies are good. A scrap of meat, if the gods are generous. Or if a donkey broke its leg. The bread is hard, but it fills the gaps. The beer is thick, sour, barely fermented. You sip it slowly, not for pleasure, but for numbness. And here, in this twilight between exhaustion and unconsciousness, the world shifts. No one's shouting. No one's pulling ropes. The night belongs to the workers, just barely. A man tells a joke, low and dry. It doesn't land, but someone chuckles anyway, Not because it's funny, but because laughter reminds you that your mouth still works for something other than biting crust. Another man hums a song you don't recognize. It's foreign, maybe Nubian, maybe from the Delta. Doesn't matter. You close your eyes and let it wash over you. It's out of tune, but in rhythm with the night. Some speak of home, a sister married, a harvest missed, a son who should be walking by now. You don't speak much. Your throat's too dry. But you listen. Listening is enough. Others play games with sticks and stones. Their fingers move stiffly, but their eyes soften. In the glow of a shared torch, they almost look young again. You sit apart sometimes, not out of distance, but out of preservation. Quiet has become your friend, even if it has sharp edges. You hear stories of a worker who carved a message into one of the foundation stones. Something about his wife's name. No one knows if it's true, but you imagine him, hands shaking, looking over his shoulder, scratching those letters into immortality. Maybe that's how you leave a trace. The stars above are sharp tonight. Too sharp. Like they could cut through this fragile silence as you lie back. The mat's rough against your spine. Your fingers twitch from the day's labor. Your toes cramp if you stretch them too far. But still, this is the best part of the day. No orders, no weight, just air. Cooler now, forgiving. And in the silence, the ruins whisper back. Not of kings, not of gods, but of you. Of men who carried too much and said too little. You think of tomorrow, of the stone that waits, of the sun that will rise, indifferent and exact. But for now, in this pocket of softness, you remember something strange. Hope, not the kind that promises change, but the kind that keeps your breath steady, that lets you imagine just for a moment that being alive, even in pain, still means something. You drift into sleep, and for a few hours the pyramid does not exist. Only stars, only dreams. You wouldn't call it rebellion. There were no banners, no chants, no great uprisings that split the desert in two. But still, you resisted, quietly, gently, in ways so small they barely had shape, because open defiance was impossible. The pyramid did not tolerate disruption. The overseers didn't need reasons, and yet something inside you refused to vanish completely. So you found cracks in the system, not to break it, but to breathe within it. You started by slowing your steps, just enough to fall slightly behind, but not enough to be noticed. A half-second pause before tying a rope, a cough that bought you 1 moment longer before pulling. Others did it too. You saw them. The man who forgot his tool. The boy who needed to fetch more water. The quiet ways bodies carved their own pace against the tide. Sometimes you misaligned a stone. Not dangerously, just slightly. A gesture, a whisper. I was here. A mark that would disappear under layers. But for a moment, it existed. There was a rhythm to these acts, a secret language, a code shared only in glances and gestures. You learned to listen differently, not just to orders, but to silences. The pause in a friend's sentence that meant someone had been beaten that morning. The long exhale that said, I can't do this much longer. You didn't talk about resistance. That word didn't exist here. But one day, a man sat down and simply refused to stand back up. No shouts, no violence, just stillness. And for a moment, just a heartbeat, the pyramid paused too. They dragged him away. You never saw him again, but you remembered. You all did. Resistance, it turns out, is not always noise. Sometimes it's silence that echoes the loudest. Some carved small shapes into the stones before they were placed. Birds, eyes, suns. Not for decoration, not for worship, just a message to the future. We were here, we felt, we endured. You once heard of a man who buried a tiny bead beneath a ramp, a bead given to him by his daughter. No one else saw. But he smiled as he did it. And that smile stayed with you longer than any speech. The food was another battlefield. When portions were low, some men shared, not much. A crust, a corner of fig, but enough to remind you that compassion hadn't crumbled under stone. And in the huts at night, when someone coughed too hard or cried in their sleep, there was always someone, even if silent, who placed a hand nearby. That too was resistance, to care in a place built on indifference. The overseers never saw these things. Or maybe they did, but chose to ignore them. After all, a man who dreams is harder to break. A man who sings even softly might keep pulling. You think of this often, that your resistance isn't about toppling thrones. It's about remembering your own name, whispering it when the stone tries to erase it. So tonight, before you sleep, you hum a song your mother once sang. Just one line, and that's enough. For now, it's enough. You were taught that the gods watched everything, that they saw through stone, through silence, through sweat, that they walked among you, not in the palaces, not in the temples, but in the wind that cooled your back, in the water that tasted sweet after hours of thirst, in the rare moments when pain lifted, even briefly. And so, you held on to ritual, not grand ones, not the chants of priests in linen robes or the formal incense of royal tombs. Your rituals were quieter, rougher, born from necessity. Each morning, before you stepped into the sun, you touched the amulet tied around your chest. A shard of stone, a carved eye, a scarab once given to you by your grandmother. Its edges were worn now, almost smoothed away, but it still held you together. You whispered to it, not prayers exactly, more like agreements. Help me return. Help me carry today. Some drew symbols in the dirt before beginning their shift, simple ones. A sun, an ankh, a circle. They erased them with their feet seconds later. But the drawing was what mattered. It gave you something the pyramid couldn't take. There was a man in your crew, older, with a voice like sand, who knew the hymns. Not all of them, just fragments. He sang them during break, low and slow. Not for show, not even for belief, just to remember. And when he sang, others listened. No one interrupted. Even the overseers stayed quiet. In the huts at night, when the air grew still, someone always lit a small lamp. Oil was precious, but light was more so. The flame was a reminder. You were more than labor. Sometimes you dreamed of gods with jackal heads or falcon wings. Sometimes you dreamed of rivers that led to other lives. Sometimes you dreamed of being weightless, of floating above the stone. These dreams mattered. They reminded you that your spirit still moved, even when your body didn't. You'd heard the stories of the weighing of the heart, of how your soul must balance against the feather of truth. You often wondered, would the gods count your labor, your endurance, the days you didn't break? You hoped so. You kept a small pouch under your mat. Inside, a a date pit, a bit of linen, and a string from your sister's wedding robe. No one knew. But every time you touched it, you felt more than skin. You felt roots. And in those moments, in that softness, you became whole again. The pyramid was built with stone, but your days were built with rituals. They were what separated you from the silence. Some men marked their arms with ink, simple lines, a name, a symbol, not for fashion, but as a kind of armor. Some buried offerings in the dirt near the ramp, a dried flower, a carved bead, a broken comb, not for the gods, perhaps, but for themselves. Because surviving here, in this place, under this weight, was not just physical. It was sacred. And you believed, had to believe, that the gods saw, even if no one else did. You remember the first time you saw them, and smaller shadows among the larger ones, stumbling behind ropes, tripping over uneven ramps. Children, too small for this place, too soft for this weight. And yet, there they were, barefoot in the dust, carrying baskets nearly their own size. Not every child labored. Some stayed in villages nearby. But those who did appear in the cantiro, they didn't play. They didn't ask questions. They just learned fast. Faster than they should have. There was a boy assigned to your crew once, no more than 8, maybe younger. Thin arms, serious eyes. He didn't speak unless spoken to. He watched everything. How you knotted rope, how you moved your weight, how to tell when an overseer was about to shout. They called him Little Dog. Not out of cruelty, but routine. Names here were temporary. You didn't ask his real one. His job was to fetch water, tools, rations, to sweep the ramps clear of debris that might trip a man hauling stone. But often, he was just there, running between crews, doing whatever was needed. You tried not to look at him, tried not to see your own younger brother in his face. But sometimes, when the sun hit just right, and he wiped his brow with the back of his tiny hand, it was impossible not to wonder what future this boy was being carved into. The truth is, he didn't have one. Not really. A child here aged faster than stone. Their voices deepened too early. Their backs curved too soon. Their hands, once meant for play, learned to grip tools, carry weight, flinch on instinct. Some children were orphans. The cantero didn't ask where you came from, only what you could do. Others were brought by their parents, laborers who had no one to leave them with, or who hoped proximity to work might bring security. But there was no security, only risk. You saw another boy once, no more than 10, slip near the quarry edge. Just a loose stone underfoot, a scream. Then silence. The work didn't stop. The next day, another child took his place. There was no schooling, no story time, no games. But sometimes, in the moments between shifts, the children would draw in the sand with sticks, faces, animals, pyramids sometimes, always crooked. It made your chest ache in a way nothing else did. Some tried to protect them, gave them easier tasks, shared scraps of food, shielded them from the worst words of the overseers. But kindness was thin here, stretched like leather until it snapped. One night, you shared your mat with Little Dog. He didn't ask, just curled beside you, shivering despite the heat. In his sleep, he whispered a name. Not yours, not his, just a name. Maybe someone he missed, maybe someone he'd already forgotten. In the morning, he was gone, reassigned, moved up the ramp. You never saw him again. But you remember the weight of his breath beside you, light, hesitant. You wonder what he believed. If he thought this life was normal, if he ever dreamed of anything beyond the stone, or if the pyramid was all he'd ever known. And that, more than anything, feels like the greatest theft, not just of strength, but of time. Because in this place, childhood isn't lost. It's ground into the sand before it ever had a chance to stand. You rarely saw them on the ramp. They didn't carry stone. They weren't listed on the records. Their names, when they existed at all, were scribbled in soft ink on the edges of life. But the women, they were there, always, in the camps beyond the dust clouds, in the corners of the workers' villages, in the shade between shouts, in the care you didn't ask for, but received anyway. You remember one woman. She brought water every morning, long before the overseers stirred. No one knew her name, or if they did, they never said it aloud. She walked with the quiet certainty of someone who had stopped waiting to be thanked. The jar she carried was chipped. The cloth over her shoulder was stiff with dried sweat. But the way she moved, it felt like ritual. She didn't smile. But once, she placed a fig in your hand. Just one. Overripe, soft, warm from her palm. You ate it slowly, as if it were sacred. Maybe it was. Most women were tied to laborers, wives, sisters, daughters. They came because there was no one else to tend the sick, cook the food, or bury the dead. Their work didn't end with sunset. They were the ones who cleaned wounds, rinsed blood from tunics, mended sandals torn by stone. They nursed infants in corners of huts while stirring porridge. They wept quietly over fevered men. They sang lullabies under the same stars that watched the pyramid rise. No one called them workers, but they worked, harder than most. Some were born free, others were not. You heard rumors of women taken during raids, assigned to the cantiro as cooks, caretakers, and in the darkest corners as comfort. No one spoke of what that meant, but you saw the bruises, the eyes that refused to meet yours, the silence too sharp to ignore. And still they endured. They braided their daughters' hair with fingers raw from grinding grain. They whispered spells over sleeping children. They traced prayers into ash. They lit fires with bones of olive wood and scraps of straw. One woman lost her husband in the quarry, crushed, quietly removed. The next day, she was sweeping the sleeping hut. She didn't speak, but her face was stone. Another kept a satchel of dried herbs tucked into the folds of her dress. She rubbed mint behind your ears when your fever came. You never asked her to. You didn't need to. She saw everything. Sometimes they gathered after dusk. Just a few sitting in a circle, repairing tunics, reweaving baskets, humming songs too old to name. And for a moment, there was peace. Not freedom, never that, but something steady, something solid. They were the backbone of a world already bent by weight. The men moved the stone, but the women kept them standing. They bore the grief, the stories, the names of the dead. They carried memory like a second skin, worn, never shed. They would not be carved into walls. But if the pyramid has a soul, it is theirs, whispered, woven, waiting. There comes a day for everyone when the stone wins. You don't see it coming. Not really. It creeps in, unnoticed at first. A deeper ache, a stumble that lingers, a cough that doesn't go away. You tell yourself it's nothing. You've worked through worse, but your body knows. It begins to disobey, quietly, slowly, until one morning your arms don't lift the rope. Your legs won't follow the path. Your breath turns shallow, sharp, like breathing through a crack in a door. The others notice, not with words, but with glances. A man offers to carry your load. A boy fills your cup before his own. No one says it aloud, but the silence wraps around you tighter than any rope. Then the overseer notices. He doesn't shout. Not this time. He just points, and you're led away. Not to rest, not to healing. Just aside. There's no infirmary, no bed, no one to tend your wounds unless someone loves you enough to pause their own labor and risk punishment. You lie down on the ground, near the edge of the camp. The sand is warm beneath your shoulder. The sky, for once, is soft. You hear the others pulling, dragging, building. The rhythm continues, without you. And in this stillness, something shifts. It's not fear. You stopped fearing death a long time ago. It's something gentler, a kind of release. You think of the ramp, of how it rises endlessly. You wonder how many stones you moved, how many cuts scar your hands. You wonder if any of them will stay, not just in memory, but in the pyramid itself. You don't hope for burial. That's for nobles, for priests, for kings wrapped in gold. You hope for a hole deep enough to keep the jackals away. You think of your mother, her voice faint as smoke. You think of water, of figs, of the time your brother made you laugh so hard you spilled a whole bowl of stew. And then, strangely, you think of stone. Not the ones you moved, but the ones you touched gently after they were placed. When the sun made them warm. When they felt complete. You breathe slower now. The fever takes hold. Or maybe the wound beneath your tunic finally reached your blood. Maybe your heart simply tired of being borrowed. No one cries. That comes later. Quietly, if at all. Your body is covered by a cloth. Perhaps a friend says your name aloud once. Perhaps not. There's no time. The next crew is already assembling. They dig a shallow grave behind the huts. One among many. No marker. No offering. But that night, someone leaves a stone beside your resting place. Small, smooth, nothing carved. But someone placed it there. And in that gesture, you're remembered, not in the stories told by kings, but in the silence shared by those who still carry. Your body couldn't go further, but your story, your breath, your labor, your endurance, it doesn't stop here. It lives in them, in the ones still pulling, in the ones still resisting, and in the pyramid, yes, even there, because stone forgets nothing. The pyramid stands, still, grand, unmoving, a shape carved into eternity. And yet, it is hollow with absence, not in structure, but in story. Because when the scribes recorded the glories of the pharaoh, the alignments of the stars, the sacred rituals of ascension, they left you out, not by accident, by design. History, they said, was written in gold, in names etched deep, in hymns for gods and kings. But you were dust, a shadow among the blocks. A name erased before it was spoken. You wonder who decided that. Who chose silence over truth, because the truth was not elegant. It didn't wear linen or speak in verse. It grunted, it bled, it collapsed under weight. The truth was a man limping up a ramp, a woman sewing bandages by firelight, A boy sleeping beside stone. You lived it, and no one wrote it down. There are fragments, of course, a scratched name inside a hidden chamber, a drawing of a man hunched with rope, a list of rations, barley, onions, beer. They call these evidence, but they don't tell the whole story. They don't say how many cried when their brother didn't return. They don't count the bruises. They don't trace the dreams abandoned for survival. They don't record the 1,000 small acts of kindness or the million tiny griefs. And so, a different kind of memory grows. Not in scrolls, but in the pyramid itself. Because every stone carries a fingerprint, not seen, but felt. A palm pressed against it in the final moment of placement. A breath exhaled in exhaustion. A whispered prayer left inside the crevice before it was sealed forever. You are there. In the tilt of a block aligned by instinct, not instrument. In the barely visible notch where someone adjusted just enough. In the quiet harmony of a structure built not just by force, but by will. They say the pyramid represents eternity, but your eternity is different. It isn't about legacy, it's about presence, about being part of something that was supposed to erase you and leaving yourself inside it anyway. Not carved, not declared, but embedded, like marrow in bone. And perhaps, just perhaps, someone else, centuries from now, will stand before the pyramid and feel something they can't name. Not awe, but ache. A soft tug, like memory. And that will be you. Still here, still breathing beneath the stone. There's a moment, late in the day, when the final stone is set. Not the top, not the gleaming capstone the priests and kings will celebrate, but a stone you carry, one of many, heavy, ordinary, gray with dust. You place it and step back, and the world doesn't change. The pyramid doesn't sing. The sky doesn't break open. The overseers don't smile. But something inside you shifts. You feel it in your hands, sore, cracked, trembling, in your shoulders carved by years of repetition. In your breath, deeper now, slower. It's not pride. It's not peace. It's quiet. The kind of stillness that comes only after you've given everything and still exist. You walk away. The ramp stretches behind you like memory. The air tastes the same. But the stone doesn't call you anymore because it's done. You look back. Once, the pyramid rises behind you, impassive. Beautiful, yes, but not sacred. Not anymore. Because you know what it cost. Not in gold, but in time, in lives, in silence. And as you walk, you wonder, what lasts longer, the stone or the memory? You return to your village, or what's left of it. People you barely recognize, children grown, elders gone. They ask what it was like. You don't answer, not because you can't, but because there aren't words soft enough to hold it. So you teach your son to plant grain gently. You tell your daughter that her hands are for shaping, not surviving. And when someone mentions the pyramid, you nod. But inside, you whisper something else. I was there. And now, the years pass. You grow slower. The heat feels heavier. Your breath comes with effort. But at night, in that sacred hush before sleep, you remember not just the pain, but the rhythm of pulling together, of singing when no one listened, of placing your hand on a stone and leaving part of yourself behind. And somehow, that rhythm, not the monument, not the king, is what remains. because the pyramid will stand. But you, your name, your silence, your story will echo in every pause between its shadows. And now, as the night deepens, may your thoughts rest too. The labor is done. And you, who bore the impossible, are finally home. The Pharaoh's eyes, power that never descends from stone. And even after the weight ceased, he was still there. Not the block, not the rope, but him, the Pharaoh. You never saw him, but you always felt him, a presence that lingered like heat, like dust, like an open eye that never blinks. His name was etched into every grain sack, stamped onto every ration jar, woven into every linen roll. Not his voice, but someone else's, carrying his will. And yet, it all came from him. The bread you were given, the schedule that tore you from sleep, the rhythm forced upon your body, the pyramid, of course, for him. But not only that, the land around it, the air above it, and even your pain, in some divine curve of logic, was part of his glory. They said he was a living God, that he breathed the same air as Ra, that his words shaped the floodwaters, the winds, time itself. And maybe it was true, because who else could make men move mountains with bare hands? Not out of choice, but because they had no other. You learned early that it was more dangerous to doubt than to believe. So you believed, or at least performed the belief well enough to avoid being noticed. Some called it faith, others called it survival. And there were those who truly felt reverence, who closed their eyes when speaking his name, who dreamed of glimpsing him someday, even from afar, cloaked in gold, riding horses that never knew thirst. But then there were the quiet ones, the ones who didn't smile at the hymns, the ones who knew, deep down, that no divine man would allow what you lived through each day. You had your doubts too. Not at first, but in time, when you watched a friend fall and not rise. When you went 3 nights in a row with the ache in your bones refusing to fade. When you heard that your neighbor's 12-year-old son had been called up because a boy's time also belonged to the throne. That's when the Pharaoh's face began to shift in your mind. No longer the face in hymns or statues. Something colder, more distant, like a sun that never warms, only burns. Still, he was everywhere. If a block slipped and killed a man, they said it was a sign from the king, or from gods who obeyed his gaze. If someone was caught resting a moment too long, it was said the Pharaoh had seen it wherever he was. That invisible surveillance was worse than the whips, because it never stopped. You started noticing it in the little things. The way people looked up even when there was nothing above them. The way they straightened their backs in certain parts of the worksite. How saying his name too loudly created silence. It was fear, yes, but also framing. His presence gave meaning to the absence of everything else, and, strangely, there was some comfort in that. On the worst days, when your body was barely a body and more a heap of aches, it was almost soothing to believe this might have a greater purpose. That the gods saw your effort. That the Pharaoh himself, stepping into the afterlife, might recognize your sweat in the stone that carried him skyward. "He'll know I pulled this block," someone said once, half laughing. But buried in that laugh was hope. You yourself, one night, ran your hand over the smooth side of a freshly placed stone and whispered something. You're not sure what it was. A prayer, a challenge, maybe just a sigh. But his name was in it. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Still, you knew. He wouldn't come. Not ever. He would not step foot on the dust you bled into. He would not meet your eyes, hand you bread, offer you water. His pyramid would grow on your shoulders, but he would never carry even a thought for you. And yet, he was everything. You learned to live with that, to carry his name in your closed mouth, to see his shadow on the floor you swept. Because in this world, the Pharaoh didn't need to be present. It was enough that you believed he was watching. And perhaps, just perhaps, that belief made you see more of yourself too. Because in the end, it wasn't him who lifted the pyramid. It was you. And he never descended from stone. Between tents and promises, life beyond the ramp. You didn't live on the ramp. Not entirely. It might have felt that way, like your body belonged to the stone, your breath measured by the next pull, your limbs stretched into rope. But there was something beyond it. At night, after the last order was barked, after the sun melted behind the distant dunes and the air shifted from blistering to brittle, you returned to a place not quite home. The camp wasn't a village. It wasn't meant to be anything lasting. Just a scatter of mud brick huts, cloth-wrapped shelters, and lean-tos stitched together with hope and necessity. Walls barely standing, roofs patched with whatever could be found. Reeds, linen scraps, broken wood. Sand found its way into everything. It blew through the air, coated your skin, slept in your eyes. Still, it was yours. Not yours to own. Nothing here ever was. But yours in the way that sweat becomes part of cloth, in the way a shadow belongs to the figure that casts it. And in this place, between the end of the shift and the start of sleep, something softer existed. You spoke, not much, not loudly. Voices were still sore from grunting commands and counting rope lengths. But there were murmurs, questions, half jokes. Someone always had a story of a village now distant, of a woman who used to hum while stirring a pot, of a child born under an eclipse. You listened. Sometimes you replied, sometimes not. You didn't always have the energy for words, but their rhythm comforted you, like wind rustling dry leaves. Someone else sharpened tools by firelight. Another stitched a torn sandal, muttering curses with every pass of the needle. A third drew shapes in the dirt. A fish, an ibis, a sun. No one said anything. No one needed to. And when someone brought bread from beyond the sight, coarse, heavy, with traces of salt, they tore it into pieces, passed it around, a gift, not a gesture. These moments didn't last long. The body demanded rest, but for a breath, maybe two, you remembered. Remembered what it felt like to have a name. A memory that didn't start with stone. You sometimes caught yourself humming. A tune your mother sang, maybe. Or a chant once heard in a market before your world became dust and echo. Others joined in without realizing. The kind of human alignment, low and ragged and off-key. But it settled over the camp like warmth. And sometimes, even laughter returned. The real kind. Sudden, ridiculous. A man tripping over his own words. A beetle falling into someone's cup. A flatbread so badly burned it cracked like pottery. No one laughed long, but even a short laugh felt sacred. There were friendships, too, born not from joy, but from shared endurance. You knew how a man moved when he was nearing collapse. You recognized the quiet in his eyes, the shuffle in his steps. You helped. Or he helped you. And when someone didn't show up the next morning, taken by heat or injury or silence, No one asked, but everyone felt it. Someone might set an extra bowl down, even if it stayed untouched. Someone else might whisper a name, just once, into the fire. It wasn't grief in the way nobles grieved. No ceremony, no stone, just memory, passed hand to hand, breath to breath. There were rituals too, not ones the priests would recognize. A man who circled his mat 3 times before lying down, to keep bad dreams away, he said. Another who knotted a string around his wrist each night, believing it tied him to his wife's spirit back home. One carved a tally into the wall each morning. Not to count days, but to prove to himself that they had passed. Time was strange here. It didn't flow. It pressed, thick and slow, like honey in the cold. Days bled into one another. You marked them with aches, with new blisters, with the angle of light hitting the ramp. And yet, within this blur, small promises bloomed. One man swore he'd leave after the last block was placed, said he'd walk until he reached the sea, never look back. Another saved every spare scrap of cloth, said he'd sew a robe someday, not for warmth, but for pride. A boy barely old enough to hold a tool spoke of learning to write, said he'd carve his name into something that would never move, not like a pyramid, like a tree. You believed them, or you didn't. But the promises mattered. They reminded you that something still waited beyond the camp, beyond the stone. You, too, made promises, quiet ones, to survive until the season turned, to find your brother and speak his name again, even if it cracked in your throat. To hold a fig in your hand once more, and let its sweetness run down your wrist. Not all promises are meant to be kept, but all are meant to carry you forward. And in the flicker of flame, in the hush between footsteps, in the tattered tent flapping in the desert wind, something stayed alive. Not just your body, but you. The part of you the ramp hadn't taken. The part that still remembered laughter and bread and songs and the shape of your name whispered in the dark. Night doesn't fall in the desert. It slips in, quiet, slow, almost respectful, like it knows that everything here is already close to breaking. The wind softens. The light drains from the stones. The heat lifts from your skin. And for a while, silence hovers over the camp. But the silence never lasts long. Soon, the stories come. They don't start with trumpets. They don't begin with once upon a time. They arrive in murmurs, in the scrape of a hand against clay, in the exhale of someone too tired to sleep. Sometimes it's a question. Did you hear about the block that moved on its own? Sometimes it's a dare. I swear the old ramp is cursed. Ask anyone. And just like that, the night becomes alive. Not with fear, not with work, but with wonder, with stories. You grew up with them, of course. Tales of gods and beasts, of Nile's spirits who rose from the mud, of jackals that spoke in riddles, of crocodiles that judged men by their scent. But here, in the camp, the stories change. They don't belong to temples anymore. They belong to you. There's the one about the ghost of a boy crushed by a stone who whispers your name if you stop to rest too long on the north ramp. His breath is cold, they say, and if you hear it, you won't wake the next morning. Or the man who carved his lover's name into the base of the pyramid and vanished the next day, taken by the gods or by the overseers. No one's sure which is worse. There's a stone, someone claims, near the back wall that bleeds if you press your ear to it. Only at night. only if you've lost someone. Another tale says the pharaoh's soul visits the site each new moon, riding in silence, cloaked in black, checking every stone to see who placed it. And if yours is crooked, you'll never rest in the afterlife. You laugh at these stories sometimes, not because they're funny, but because they're yours. You invent new ones. A man whose sweat turns to gold. A woman who sings the stars into the sky. A stonecutter who found a tunnel beneath the pyramid and escaped into another world. You tell these stories because they give shape to the pain. Because in the dark, when your hands are still, your mind begins to ache louder than your muscles. And a story, it fills the gap. It doesn't have to be true. In fact, it's better when it's not. Truth has rules. Stories don't. In the stories, you're not a laborer. You're a magician, a hero, a trickster who fooled death. You outrun the overseer. You speak with Anubis. You place the last stone and the gods applaud. And for a few minutes, no one hurts. No one is hungry. No one is forgotten. Sometimes, the stories teach things. Warnings wrapped in myth. Like the one about the man who stole extra rations and woke to find his tongue turned to dust. Or the tale of the three friends who tried to leave the site in secret and found themselves walking in circles until sunrise, the pyramid always on the horizon, never growing closer, never farther away. You've heard versions of these in different accents, from men born in far villages. Some swear they heard them as children. Others say they dreamed them. It doesn't matter. They're real now. One night, an old man begins a story about a stone that sings. Everyone goes quiet. He speaks slowly, voice cracked like dried mud. He says the stone only sings once it's in place, when no one's watching. It hums a song so deep it moves through your bones. And if you hear it, really hear it, it tells you your future. Someone laughs. The old man doesn't. He says he heard it once. The next day, his son fell from the ramp. The camp falls silent. No one asks if it's true. That's not the point. You tell stories like people once lit fires in caves, not just for warmth, but to remind themselves they were alive, that they had language, imagination, that something inside them still reached for the stars. Here, under this half-ruined sky, with your body drained and your soul stretched thin, the stories are a rope, a lantern, a spell. They remind you of things the ramp tries to erase. Your childhood, your fears, your wonder, your power. Because sometimes the only thing more powerful than the pharaoh is a well-told lie that feels true. And when the last voice fades, and the last ember dies, and the wind wraps itself around your shoulders like a blanket made of sighs, you close your eyes, and you dream. Not of stone, but of stories. The other side of the pyramid, what the nobles never saw. There was another side to the pyramid, not just the shadow it cast across the desert floor. Not the mathematical symmetry that made scholars speak in awe centuries later. Not the celestial alignments charted by priests. Another side, one you lived in, and one they never saw. The nobles came rarely, and when they did, it was like the wind changed. Their arrival always preceded by messengers, sandals unscuffed by dust, hands that hadn't held a tool in years, or ever. They rode in with litters and shade and silence, their faces hidden by gold-threaded cloths to protect against the sun, as if even nature should not dare touch them. You knew the day before. The overseers cleaned the ramps. Extra water was poured to harden the sand. The workers were arranged, not for efficiency, but for appearance. You hated those days, not because they were harder, but because they were lies. The nobles walked between blocks, pointing at things they didn't understand. They asked questions they didn't care to hear answered. They nodded at measurements, at engravings, at the gods etched into the outer walls. They saw order, precision, triumph, but they didn't see you. Not the man with the broken toe who still limped to work. Not the boy whose back was hunched too early. Not the woman wiping blood from her brother's hand with the edge of her own tunic. They didn't see the way your hands curled at night, even when you slept. Or how your dreams had stopped including anything other than ramps and dust. They praised the symmetry, but not the calluses. They admired the ambition, but not the ache. Sometimes one would speak, not to you, but near you. This will be a wonder, one said, his voice smooth with assurance. A legacy for eternity. And in that moment you realized they didn't think you were part of that eternity. Only the stones were. You, the hands that placed them, were temporary, replaceable. You weren't insulted. You were erased. Once, a noble dropped a cloth and you returned it. He didn't look at you. He just took it and turned back to the blueprints, as if you had no weight, as if your presence was merely air passing by. But you were not air. You were gravity. You were the force that held the pyramid to the earth. Without you, there was no wonder. You saw how they flinched at the sun, how they hated the sand in their shoes, how their guards kept distance from the workers, afraid, perhaps, of being touched by effort. And you wondered, who were they building this for? Not for gods, not really, for each other. So one day, someone might look at the pyramid and say, this shows how great we were. Not you. Not we, as in the ones who carried and hauled and bled. We, as in the ones who watched it rise from a shaded platform. There was a kind of violence in that, not the kind that bruises skin, the kind that erases names. You once heard a noble complaining about the labor cost. Said too many men were falling ill. Said maybe fewer rations would push the rest to work harder. You stood nearby. He didn't see you, but you saw him. And in that moment, something hardened in your chest. A truth you'd always known, but had never looked in the eye. They would never understand the pyramid. Not really. Because they only saw the height, not the depth, not the graves behind the ramps, not the stories told over broken bread. Not the quiet kindnesses passed between hands when the overseers looked away. They saw a monument. You saw a memory. They saw victory. You saw cost. And someday, when the wind shifts and the stones begin to crack, when the gods no longer walk among the stars they once claimed as homes, and the names of kings fade from temple walls, your story will still be here. In the grooves of the stones, in the spaces between symmetry, in the breath you gave without being asked. The nobles never saw that side of the pyramid. But that side, your side, is the one that lasts. When the sand swallows time, what was meant to be forgotten? Not all stones were meant to be seen. Not every wall was meant to stand, and not every story was meant to survive. Some things, some truth, were buried on purpose. The pyramid, they say, is eternal, a monument to perfection, an object of mathematical wonder, divine geometry, celestial logic. But if you've ever seen the cracks in a block before the overseer noticed, if you've ever watched a ramp crumble beneath your feet, you know, it was never flawless. There were mistakes, errors smoothed over with new stone, hidden with plaster, covered with prayers. There were days when an entire section collapsed, not from sabotage, but from miscalculation. But the Pharaoh was never told, not directly. Instead, the engineers blamed the gods. An omen, they said, a sign. They offered incense, redrew the plans, and started again. And you just worked harder. No one asked why the same wall was being rebuilt for the third time. No one dared. You simply placed your hands where the last ones had failed and hoped yours wouldn't be next. You remember a ramp that twisted wrong, a slope too steep, the stone that slipped, massive, slow as thunder, crushing 3 men beneath it. You saw it happen, heard it before you turned. The ground trembled like fear. There was silence afterward, the kind of silence that tastes like iron. The site shut down for 2 days, not to mourn, to plan. When the noble arrived, he was told the men had been transferred. You didn't speak. You watched the bodies buried at dusk behind the old quarry wall. No names, no markers. The ramp was adjusted, a new curve laid. The old one left to vanish under sand. That's how forgetting begins. Not with lies, with silence. Other things disappeared too, tools that failed. Overseers who pushed too hard and were removed, not for cruelty, but for disruption. After all, cruelty was expected, but disobedience, that could spread. You once worked beside a man who carved lines into every stone he touched. 3 small scratches, always in the same pattern. His mark, his signature. Quiet, harmless, until someone noticed. Then he was gone. The stones were sanded, the marks erased. You didn't ask questions, because even now, centuries later, you remember how dangerous memory can be. You heard of workers who refused to continue until they were fed. Not a rebellion, a plea. Bread, not freedom. They were beaten, not to punish, to erase. By morning, the line was straight again. The story gone, but some of it stayed. In whispers passed between hands. In songs hummed too low for priests to hear. In the rhythm of footsteps around places no one mapped. There was a pit, dry, forgotten, where someone had scratched an entire tale into the earth. A story of a man who lost his brother in the quarry and carried his memory like a blade. The wind erased it by morning, but you saw it. Once. You remember. Some say that every pyramid has a hollow inside it, not for chambers or treasure, but for shame. The things no inscription dares name, the cracks in legacy, the truths too real to survive eternity. And what of the workers themselves? Where are their names? The scribes counted them, but not as men. They were tallies, ration markers, hands. One scroll listed out in tools and bodies assigned to a project. Tools first. Perhaps that was a mistake, but perhaps it wasn't. Because forgetting isn't always an accident. Sometimes it's policy. Sometimes it's the only way a system like this can keep going, by making sure no one remembers who held the burden longest. But you remember, still. You remember the boy who braided rope faster than anyone, the woman who sang over wounds to keep the pain at bay, the man who carved prayers into the inside of his sandals, so the gods would see his footsteps, if not his face. They are not in the tombs, not on the walls, but they are here, in you. in every moment of breath under pressure, in every time your hands kept moving after your hope paused. That is how stories survive. Not always in ink, but in the refusal to be silent. In the choice to speak a name, even when no one listens. And now, you speak them again. Not to correct the past, but to remind the present that forgetting is not neutral. It is choice, and tonight, you choose to remember what the sand tried to swallow, what the scribes left out, what the Pharaoh never saw, but what you always carried. And if someone listens, a whisper to the future. What happens to a story when no one tells it? Does it vanish? Or does it wait, buried, dormant, folded into stone, pressed like a dried flower between the pages of time? You've wondered this before. Not during the day. The ramp leaves no room for such questions. But at night, when the fire is low and the camp breathes quietly in sleep, the thought returns. What if someone listens? What if, long after your hands have stiffened and your name has faded, someone leans close enough to the wind to hear the echo of your breath? You never had a monument, no stele carved with your likeness, no statue bathed in oil, but still, you were here, and that matters. You existed in the weight of the block, in the callus on your palm, in the wrinkle at the corner of your mouth that only appeared when you laughed. Yes, even here, you laughed. There's something sacred in that. They told you only the Pharaoh would live forever. But look, the pyramid still stands. And inside it, not in its tombs, but in its silence, is the shape of you. Every block remembers the hands that steadied it. Every ramp hums with the feet that trod it. Every shadow cast by that impossible geometry once passed over your face. The pyramid was never just his. It was yours. You who whispered your child's name into the stone before laying it down. You who folded prayers into the seam of your tunic. You who tied knots not just with rope, but with the will to keep going when everything said stop. You who mourned in silence because even grief had to be quiet. So what happens now? Maybe this is it. Maybe someone centuries later lights a candle, clicks play, hears a voice. Not yours, but one carrying your breath, your ache, your dream. And in that moment, time folds. The fire crackles. The air thickens. And your story, long silenced, rises like dust in a sunbeam. They might imagine the pyramid differently now, not just as math and mystery, but as memory, as a testament not to one man's afterlife, but to thousands of lives that made it possible. And perhaps, just perhaps, their breath will slow, their shoulders will drop, their day will soften, because they know now. Someone else, long ago, endured too, and survived, not as a hero, not as a myth, but as a person, like them, like you. Maybe that's enough. No, maybe that's everything. You never needed your name in gold. You only needed to be remembered in full, not as a statistic, not as a shadow, but as a voice. And here it is, again, carried across time, not shouting, just whispering, soft, steady. I was here. I mattered. I moved the stone. And if someone hears it, really hears it, then nothing was lost. Not really. Because stories only die when we stop listening. And tonight, someone listened. So sleep now. You earned it. The pyramid is quiet. But inside it, your voice still breathes. The weight of the promise. The pyramid that never ended. It was supposed to end. Not tomorrow. Not even next season. But someday. That's what they told you. When you arrived at the site, skin still unburnt, hands still unfamiliar with the pattern of rope and stone, someone whispered it into your ear, like a secret, too fragile to say aloud. It will be done, eventually. You clung to that, even when your feet bled, even when your arms trembled from the strain, even when the sun refused to be merciful. You held on to the idea that the last stone would come, that the ramp would fall silent, that your body would belong to you again. But it didn't end. Not that year, not the next. It kept rising, stone after stone, ramp after ramp. Your body grew older in its shadow, and still it rose. You started to notice things. How the plans changed. How new blocks were ordered even before the previous tier was complete. How talk of finishing soon shifted into restructuring the west face. How overseers who once promised relief now avoided your gaze. The pyramid was no longer a project. It was a horizon. A thing that receded as you approached. That grew taller the harder you tried to reach its top. Some called it sacred. Others called it punishment. You began to call it a lie, but not out loud. Never out loud. There were days when you imagined finishing. You pictured it. The final stone slid into place with reverent hands. A priest chanting, a feast, a return to your village. The joy of planting again, of watching crops grow instead of hauling blocks that never would. You imagined your child, the one you hadn't seen in 5 years, running to meet you. You imagined lifting him with arms that remembered how. But those thoughts became painful, so you buried them, like everything else. Instead, you counted seasons. You knew it was your 3rd flood since arriving, maybe 4th. You stopped trying to name them. Others did the same. One man carved lines into the beam of his shelter. Another tied knots in a string beside his bedroll. One by one, they stopped, not because they lost track, because it hurt to keep track. Hope, here, was a currency that expired quickly. The pyramid changed, too. Not just in height, in mood. It began to feel like something alive, something that fed on you, that drank your sweat, your time, your youth. It didn't just demand labor, it demanded belief. And when belief faltered, it demanded submission. You watched men who had once joked between shifts now move like ghosts. You saw a boy, bright, clever, lose his voice for weeks. You found yourself humming without realizing, just to fill the silence your mind could no longer tolerate. And through it all, the promise that someday it would be done. But done for who? Not for you. Not for the men around you, whose backs were crooked, whose hands were curled like dry leaves. Done for a name that would be carved on the inside of the highest chamber. For a soul that would ascend while yours lay buried in the sand outside its walls. And that's when the truth sank in. The pyramid wasn't built to end. Not really. Its purpose was never the final stone. It was the labor itself. The act of building, of consuming men, was its ritual. Its offering. And once you saw that, everything changed. You stopped imagining the last day. You stopped hoping for completion. You worked not because you believed in the future, but because the present gave you no choice. And still, there was something strangely grounding in that. Because even if the pyramid never ended, your body did. Your life would. You began to find rhythm in that truth. The beat of rope pulled in sync. The sigh of sandals against packed earth, the thud of stone against stone, a music that no priest could hear, but your blood understood. You told yourself, I don't need the promise. I only need today. This breath, this motion, this moment, that became your temple. A place not of faith, but of endurance. And when new workers arrived, fresh-faced, frightened, you didn't lie to them. You didn't say it would be done. You didn't speak of freedom. You taught them how to wrap rope to avoid blisters, how to press their backs just so against the load, how to breathe through the pain. You passed on what mattered. Not hope, skill, resilience. You began to see yourself as part of something older than the pyramid, older than the pharaoh, the line of those who carry what was never meant to be carried. And suddenly, that meant something. You were never building for the gods. You were building for each other. Each breath, each motion, each act of silent perseverance, not for legacy, not for reward, but so the man beside you could keep moving. And in that, you found a truth greater than any promise, because the pyramid would never end. But neither would the courage it took to lift the stone anyway. Scars in the sand. What the body remembers when the century passes, the stone forgets. That's what they say. No matter how much blood is spilled, how much sweat soaked into its surface, the stone keeps nothing. It does not remember your face. It does not call your name. It bears no grief. But the body remembers everything. You feel it first in your knees. Not the ache of a long day, but something deeper. A kind of swelling that does not pass with rest. A warmth where there should be bone. Then in your hands, the joints stiffen. The fingers that once wrapped rope with instinctive grace begin to shake. They don't obey the way they used to. They hesitate, they throb at night. The back follows. Not the sharp pain of strain, a dull, slow folding. You find yourself bending without realizing, hunching into the shape the ramp carved into you, as if the pyramid still rests between your shoulder blades. You're not old, not by the measure of elders, but your body is. It aged faster than you did, and it remembers. Not in words, but in reaction. You wake before dawn, not out of duty, but because your ribs ache if you lie too long. You reach for tools even on your rest days. Your fingers trace invisible rope in the dark, looping knots that no longer exist. And there are other signs. A callus on your palm where no new work demands it. A limp that returns in the cold. A scar you don't remember earning, but which your skin carries like scripture. Your reflection, when you catch it in still water, is someone else. Someone who has carried more than stone. You tell yourself you're fine, that you're still strong. But there are moments, private and sharp, where you realize how much you've given away. Not just years, shape, breath. The way you once walked through a field without calculation, you've lost that. You step now with caution. Not fear, just awareness. The ground is not an ally. It shifts. It takes. And yet, you keep moving, not out of habit, but because the motion itself is memory. Each step is proof that the body still holds something sacred. Persistence. You know men who broke earlier, men whose hands trembled too much to hold a bowl, who forgot how to stand without a block to lean on. You cared for one once, washed his legs when he could no longer bend, listened as he spoke to ghosts, not out of madness, but because they were the only ones who remembered the way he used to move. You saw him die without ceremony. The camp said nothing. The wind took his last words. But your body did not forget him. His absence became a weight you still carry, just as others will carry yours. Not in mourning, in movement. You've started teaching the younger ones to stretch before lifting, to favor one shoulder when the other starts to burn, to recognize the sound of their own breath when it becomes ragged. You do this not out of kindness, but out of understanding. Because the body is not a tool. It is a record of labor, of survival, of resistance. Even now, you can recall the day your hand first blistered, the way you bit your lip to stop from crying out, the way another man, older, gave you a strip of cloth without speaking. You still have that cloth. It's gray now, almost dust. But when you hold it, your hand remembers the sting, the heat, the quiet kindness. And there's more. Memories that have no visible mark, but that live in posture, in gesture, in the way your body tenses at certain sounds. The bark of a supervisor, the crack of rope, the rhythm of sandals against stone. They don't frighten you, but they pull something up from inside you. A recognition, a scar you can't show. And sometimes when the camp sleeps and the fire has burned low, you press your palm to your chest, not because it hurts, but because you're afraid one day the memory will slip away. Not from your mind, from your body. That you'll wake and not feel the ache in your legs. That you'll stand and forget how to shift your weight when carrying. That your muscles will lose the song they've sung for so many years. And when that day comes, who will you be? Not a builder, not a laborer, just a name no one remembers. Unless someone touches the stone and feels the groove left by 1,000 hands. Unless someone steps into the camp and smells the old fire, the dust baked into the ground, the sweat woven into the beams. Unless someone bends to pick up a worn cloth, a frayed rope, a smooth shard of flint, and wonders who last held it. And unless they ask, whose body broke to build this? Whose body endured? Then, maybe then, your body will speak again. Not with words, but with presence. With the way the air remembers. With the way the sand holds the shape of a foot just a little longer than it should. With the way the pyramid, silent though it is, leans slightly east, not by accident, but because one man, one day, placed one stone a breath too far. That's how your story survives. Not in books, not in statues, but in the rhythm of scars, in the tilt of walls, in the memory of the body, passed on, muscle to muscle, breath to breath. You are not gone. You are movement, still here, still seen, still scarred, still sacred. The stone that doesn't move, the day you decide to stay. One day, the work ends. Not because the pyramid is finished, it never truly is, but because your body can no longer lift, because the rope slips from your hands instead of obeying, because someone else is younger now, stronger, faster. You're no longer called. At first, you wait, a day, then 2. You tell yourself it's a mistake, that someone forgot to send word. You tighten your sandals, stretch your back, prepare to walk toward the ramp again. But the summons never comes. Instead, someone appears at your tent. He's polite, but his eyes are already looking past you. It's time, he says. You nod. There's nothing to argue. No farewell. Just silence. You're not punished. You're not honored. You are released. For a while, you wander the edges of the site. You watch others do what you once did. Pull, push, sweat, fall, rise. And you wonder, how many more will come? How many more backs will carry this rising stone? The wind doesn't answer. You think of leaving, returning to a village you haven't seen in a decade, to people who may no longer remember your name or who never knew it. You imagine a quiet life, a smaller rhythm, days measured not in block counts, but in bread loaves, in fish caught, in shade found beneath a tree. But when you try to picture it, nothing comes. Your body does not know that rhythm anymore. It knows only this: stone, heat, the scent of sand pressed into linen, the creak of worn rope, the thump of your own heartbeat echoing in your ears after a full day's lift. So you stay, not out of duty, not out of pride, but because this place, for all its pain, is the only shape you now recognize. And slowly, a new rhythm finds you. You begin to sweep the edge of the camp, not because you're asked, but because it calms your hands. You boil water for the younger ones returning from shift. You tell them nothing about the pharaoh, but everything about the knots. You show them how to wrap cloth around sore wrists, how to speak to the stone so it does not betray them. You become a presence, not a leader, not a ghost, a stone that does not move. And in that stillness, others begin to gather. A boy who limps, a woman whose brother never returned from the eastern ramp, an old friend who no longer climbs the slope, but who still hums the loading chants at night. You share bread, share fire, share silence. You build no structure. You carve no words. But slowly, a space takes shape. A place where memory sits without shame. Where laughter still arrives, rough-edged, cracked, but real. Where the weight of the past doesn't vanish, but is carried together. One morning, a child arrives, small, wide-eyed. You don't know his name. He doesn't know yours, but he sits beside you, waits, doesn't speak. You hand him a small rope, show him a knot. He watches, then tries. And something opens, not just in him, in you. Because this is what you were always building. Not just the pyramid, but the line between hands, the line between generations, the invisible structure of understanding passed from scar to scar, the unspoken legacy of endurance. You realize suddenly that this is not the end. This is the moment the work truly begins. Because the pyramid will stand. Yes. It may even last forever. But only if someone remembers the truth of how it rose. Only if someone listens. Only if someone chooses to stay. Not because they must, but because they cannot leave behind what they've built inside themselves. You are not a monument. You are not history. You are presence. You are choice. You are the stone that does not move. And someday, when even the pyramid begins to crumble, when the wind reclaims the ramps and the names of kings fade into nothing, someone will find this place, this quiet edge of a forgotten camp. They'll find the circle of stones where you once sat. And if they listen carefully, they might hear the echo, not of gods, not of glory, but of breath, of hands teaching hands, of memory, still warm, still here, still waiting.